Bhagavad, the Siddhi women venerate my Misra, his sister, who is associated with the powers of fertility. Even today, Siddhi women in Ahmedabad perform basti, a ritual during the month of Ramazan, during the course of which they sing zikr, accompanied by my Misra bead rattles. Thus, music and dance play a central role in the formation and perpetuation of Siddhi identity. Amongst the Siddhis, female saints occupy a prominent place. Mai Mishra is one of the 7 female saints who, along with 11 male saints, is venerated as being the ancestors of the Siddhis. According to legend, Baba Ghor had 4 sisters, all of whom are revered. Siddhi women reenact the memories of an African past through ritual performances. They actively participate in the rituals of spirit possession, during the course of which they serve as spirit mediums. This possession, known as Valgar or Vai, has as its objective the exorcism of evil spirits and the curing of sickness and disease. This indirectly serves as a strategy to empower them, while they also preserve and perpetuate the mytho-poetic memories of Africa that contributes to awakening and keeping alive the diasporic consciousness amongst the younger generation. Siddhi women play a central role in the rituals centered on the various rites of passage, such as menstruation, marriage, the birth of the first child, and, of course, death. Amongst the Siddhis of South Gujarat, the onslaught of menstruation is known as Odani Odna, or the donning of the headscarf, also sometimes referred to as Cheti Beti, sitting at a distance. The latter is a reference to the fact that during this time she is isolated and made to sit on gunny bags, jute bags, for about 6 days and prohibited from cooking or touching anything. This probably is an adaptation from the Hindu traditions in which a menstruating woman is considered ritually impure. After 7 days, she's given a bath and her hair is washed. She is assisted by several female relatives and adorned with garlands of flowers. Marriage customs. Siddhi Jamaats have endeavored to maintain the purity of the blood through endogamous marriages, and consequently marriage outside the clan is prohibited. As I mentioned, the one exception being the Siddhis of Jafrabad, who married into the Muslim aristocracy. There are some interesting references in the 19th century to African women who became queens or consorts of nawabs or rulers. This is in stark contrast to slavery in the New World, where this would never have happened. These include Meher Lekta Begum, the 3rd wife of the Nawab of Bengal; Yasmin Mahal, one of the wives of Wajid Ali Shah, the last true king of Awadh, who is represented in a number of royal paintings. Others include Vidya Rose Mahal, a former slave and later the 3rd wife of the Nawab of Awadh, and Bamba Muller, who married the last ruler of the Sikh Empire in northern India and was given the title of Maharani Bamba. The Rajput surnames of many Siddhis, like Parmar, Makwana, Darbar, Rathod, Mari, Kamkat, Nobi, etc., suggest their ancestral affinities to Rajput clans and dynasties, whereas other surnames denote their ancestral affinity with seafaring, coastal communities, and linkages with Muslim Nawab families. These include names like Miawa, Jamburi, Vajuguru, Mandida, Badsha, Soibi, Badran, Naubi, Mazgula, etc. While practicing Muslim religion, Siddhis nevertheless have adopted and adapted several Hindu customs. Just prior to the marriage, turmeric powder or haldi is anointed on the bride's body. This is to make her fair, supposedly. This ritual, known as Piti Cholvi, is accompanied by the singing of marriage songs. On the appointed day of the wedding, the groom's party arrives in a procession at the bride's home and is accorded a warm welcome, accompanied by the beating of drums and the use of air-blowing instruments. They are also treated to refreshments. This welcome, known as Samaya, is known as Samaya. Thereafter, the marriage ceremony is conducted by the Qazi or a Muslim priest, according to Islamic tradition, and is known as Nikah Parna. Witnesses from both the groom and the bride are present, and permission of the Jamaat is required for the marriage. During the last few months of pregnancy, a ceremony is performed called Koda Bharna or Simant, when the wife is given gifts and a ritual feast takes place. The newborn child is seen as a gift from Allah, and on the third day following birth, family and friends come to visit the newborn, bearing gifts for the mother and the newborn child. On the sixth day, referred to as Chatti, the child is given a name. The borrowing of certain Hindu social customs by the Siddhis is thus evident from the adoption of the practice of Peti, Simant, Mandap, Mameru, etc., but also the use of certain linguistic terms to denote kinship patterns, such as Dikro, which means son, Gharwali, Kaka, uncle, Bhanej, nephew, Vevai, in-laws, and Fua. There is a tiny village called Mandal, a few miles outside of Maoa, in coastal Saurashtra region, which is home to several Siddhi families who have settled there. Amongst them, when a pregnant woman approaches the time of delivery, she is taken to the ocean and given a bath. After she has bathed with seawater, they return home with a vessel of seawater. This is placed in one corner of the house. When the child is born, the newborn is given a bath using that water from the sea. When the women return from the ocean carrying this water, they sing a song that contains both Swahili and Gujarati words. And the song says, Allah Malik Dangora, Dariya Jaja Dangora, Ghadili Av Dangora, Bal Navra Dangora, Allah Malik Dangora. The above folk song reflects the borrowing of Swahili words in the folk songs of the Siddhis. It represents an appeal to God to give blessing to the newborn infant, who will be given a bath with the waters of the ocean, which are believed to have a purificatory effect. Thus, it is evident from the above discussion that Siddhi social customs and practices represent an amalgam of Hindu and Muslim tradition with some residue survivals from the African past. It reflects to a very large extent the process of acculturation in which they have adapted and borrowed from the mainstream society. What distinguishes the roles and status of Siddhi women in India is, of course, the importance placed on female saints as founders and the ritual space created for them as ancestors of the community. Elements of kinship and marriage become the vehicle for remembering and honoring the women of the African diaspora. While little mention or no mention is made about Siddhi women in historical records, recent research by scholars promises to shed new light on the much overlooked subject. Women of African descent have been viewed as concubines and household slaves only. Research indicates that in states such as Awadh, the women were recruited as bodyguards and valued for their bravery and loyalty. The Nawab Wajid Ali Khan employed African women as personal bodyguards, and these female African fighters were organized into a female platoon who wore short pleated skirts over loose trousers to enable them to ride horses. During the mutiny of 1857, when Indian troops rebelled against the British and attempted to overthrow them, a number of African slaves, men as well as women, loyal to the Nawab, participated in the fighting. Official records suggest that Africans fired upon British troops from trees and rooftops. Among those who died valiantly were African women, and in the words of a British officer, they fought like wild cats, and it was not till after they were killed that their sex was even suspected. Even more significantly, a handful of them became wives, notably during the reign of Wajid Ali Khan, the last ruler of Awadh, who was said to have been particularly attracted to dark-skinned women. He was reputed to have 375 wives, amongst whom mention is made of Fizza, the Abyssinian, who was given the title of Jahanara, the queen. Other Africans mentioned are Yasmin Mahal, whom the Nawab married in 1843, and Ajaib Khanum, known as Hazrat Mahal. According to Ishnama, the latter wives also appear in the royal paintings, and this is something more research needs to be done. Similarly, some of the wives of the rulers of the state of Janjira also claim African descent. African queens and royal wives have been immortalized in the paintings of Awadh, Deccan, and Bengal. Little or no mention is made of Siddhis in Gujarati literature, either in biographies or fictional work. But I'm now discovering that there are short stories, particularly one that I looked at called Siddhi Ane Kachi Vartao, in which there is mention of the inner resilience and strength of Siddhi women. What distinguishes the roles and Siddhis status of Siddhi women in India is, of course, the importance placed on saints and the ritual space according to them. According to them. Siddhi women also play a prominent role in the Ud ceremony and the Dhamal dances, particularly those that were intended to induce the spirit of divination. They are actively involved in communicating with deceased ancestors, invoking their spirits and appeasing them. They served us as healers and curers, and in this role gained considerable power and influence. They danced to the accompaniment of high-pitched pipe and drums. Both men and women participate in the dance, the latter often playing a prominent role. In the middle of the dancing circle, says the Gazette of 1901, stands the Siddhi Patelni, or head woman of the tribe, now beating time to the rhythm of the music, now encouraging the dancer with loud words of approval or slapping a drummer to arouse his failing energy. This description suggests the Siddhi women were not passive, but often played a vital role. Despite the constraints of poverty and lack of education, Siddhi girls are increasingly aspiring to become educated and seek employment. One such success story is that of Rosina Chotiara, a 27-year-old who was born and brought up in the Gir forests of Gujarat. She has the distinction of being the first Siddhi woman to become a forest ranger responsible for the protection of the lion population in the Gir forest. A handful of Siddhi women have also distinguished themselves in sports, especially in athletics, such as Kamla Babu Siddhi, who broke an international record and brought glory to her country. Recent efforts to empower Siddhi women include not just the encouragement of competitive sports, but also the establishment of Sidi Goma Al-Mubrik Charitable Trust in Bhavnagar, which aims to create new spaces and economic opportunities for women. In 2004 was established the Mahila Vikas Foundation to make Sidi women economically self-reliant. Other commendable efforts to raise women and empower them include the work of Hirba Ibrahim Lobi of Jammu, who was awarded the Padma Shri Award for her work in the uplifting of Sidi women and the promotion of education and the protection of the environment. Another effort launched by Sidi women to preserve African traditions is the revival of quilt making, which has its roots in Africa. These quilts called kawandi have patchwork of geometrical designs and are made from patches of cloth and old saris by the Sidi women. The finished quilts are gifted to newly married couples. The revival of this ancient African tradition of quilt making serves to preserve traditions while providing women with an independent source of income. More research, I conclude, more research on the roles and contributions of Sidi women will undoubtedly unearth valuable material that can shed light on these previously invisible women, the Sidi communities. Thank you.
Thank you for this lovely presentation. Because in the interest of time, we will move directly to the next presentation. Dr. Yeah. So our next presenter is Brinda Mehta, faculty at Queen's College, Northeastern University, Oakland. The paper they are presenting today is Women's Anti-War Poetry from Northeast India, claiming indigeneity, denouncing militarized violence.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My presentation will focus on a selection of indigenous women poets from Northeast India. I'm particularly excited to talk about these poets because authors from the Northeast have been excluded from India's rich post-colonial literary traditions, as well as the general field of post-colonial literature. Their writings have been confined to ghettoized anthologies of writings from the Northeast without being included in the broader spectrum of contemporary Indian and Indian diaspora writings. The women suffer another level of invisibility due to their marginalized outsider status as indigenous women poets and the biopolitical power structures that separate the mainland India from the periphery, the Northeast. I begin with a quote by poet Mona Zoti from the state of Mizoram. This poem sets the tone for my presentation. Poetry must be raw like a side of beef, should drip blood, remind you of sweat and dust, remind you of sweat and dusty slaughter and the epidermal crunch and the sudden bullet to the head. In her poem, What Poetry Means to Ernestina in Peril, Mona Zoti establishes the parameters of poetic production from the northeastern region of India, an area marked by the ruthlessness of British colonization, the exceptionalism of the Indian state that places itself above and beyond the law, ethno-nationalism, the marginalization of indigenous people, and unrelenting cruelty against civilians. In such a fraught situation, women in particular have had to bear the brunt of the militarized violence that festers in conflict zones. According to Zoti, poetry must exhibit a certain rawness to convey the terror and sustain conflict, to adequately express the traumas experienced by a region under siege. Each verse should resound with the crunching of military boots and the targeted cracking of the sudden bullet as it extinguishes human life unexpectedly and intentionally. This poetry animates the genre of what I term poésie vérité, the poetic art of documenting in free verse the unnameable, the invisible, and whatever lies behind the superficiality of surface images and impressions. Poésie Vérité is a riff on Cinéma Vérité, a movement started in France by Jean Ghosh in the 1960s. It was also known as direct cinema, favoring a documentary style of representation more than pure aesthetics. In a sense, Poésie Vérité or documentary poetry is a style used by the committed writer who, according to Salman Rushdie, and I quote, promises to name the unnameable, to point at frauds, to make I'll just repeat that once more. Promises to name the unnameable, to point at frauds, to take sides, start arguments, shape the world, and stop it from going to seed. Rushdie underscores the writer's responsibility of consciousness raising to avoid general indifference and intellectual apathy. In a similar vein, Naga poet Esterin Iralu issues a dire warning about the dangers of disavowing the historicity of the Northeast region. The denial of the right to tell our stories violates our humanity. The telling of a story is not only an artistic action, it is a spiritual exercise that is an integral part of the healing of the people's psychological wounds. End quote. Going back to Zoti, we thereby see that she's not making the case to use poetry as a form of counter-violence. Instead, the desire for the dripping blood of poetry is a figure of speech to represent and eschew violence rather than to enact it. This poetry represents a testimonial to time and history and a gender documentation of conflict. These poets represent word warriors who use words and imagery to both image war in their writings while denouncing the biopolitical agendas of the state and the competing insurgencies that seek to control and subjugate their lives. I raise the following questions. How does poetry express the inexpressible dimensions of trauma and conflict by uncovering the very source of violence? Can poetry give voice to the unarticulated silences of history that have camouflaged the murderous intent of the militarized and domestic patriarchies in the region? Does poetry express what Mamandai from Arunachal Pradesh calls the specific sorrow of women without sentimentality and concession? How does poetry narrate this never-ending story of conflict in verses of resistance, traumatic affect, and protest, quote, when language becomes an extremely important site of struggle, for it is in poetry that the voices of those who struggle are heard, end quote, as stated by indigenous scholar Sakri. Poetry represents the humanizing of history for these poets who write from the heart of conflict. They have bemoaned the futility of this never-ending agenda of conflict and militarization as a serious crisis of the imagination. If war and insurgency have led to festering wounds in the non-resolution of conflict, does poetry provide an outlet to heal the wounds of war experienced by the poet and her community? Or does the poetic articulation of pain further deepen these scarred lesions in interminable drippings of raw blood evoked in Soti's poem? This poetry raises questions that can only be answered by other questions, a sign of the ongoing instability in the region. Naga poet Mona Lisa Chankija has a long trajectory of combining writing with activism in her multiple roles as poet, social activist, journalist, and editor. She has been targeted by Indian nationalists and Naga insurgents alike for her powerful writings that speak truth to power without compromise or concession. Chankija's anti-war poems are grouped together in her second collection of poetry, Monsoon Warning, under the title Death, Violence, and Bloodshed. This title underscores the risks an engaged writer is willing to take to speak out against terror and violence. The poet challenges her detractors to replace their phallic power-wielding guns with the more enduring power of productive dialogue and debate instead. At the same time, she also reveals her intention to choose death over censorship in the absence of such exchanges. She issues a double warning to those who seek to silence her in the poem Not to Be Dead. If tomorrow my body is riddled with bullets, I shall not be dead, nor will I be defeated and silenced. Poetry will remain Changija's credo for life and death as her voice achieves immortality in writing, quote, while our land is awash with blood, end quote. Monsoon Morning is dedicated to the subalterns of history, quote, dedicated to those that history ignored, end quote. In this volume, the poet explores the dynamics of coloniality through patriarchal collusions between sovereign control, ethno-nationalism, and gendered violence that have created an exceptional state of terror in Nagaland. This ambiguity is reflected in the title's ironic juxtaposition. The monsoon suggests a time of renewal and rebirth, symbolizing the power of life. Yet, conflict, deforestation, and abusive industrialization have deeply violated the Earth's ecotones, creating floods, mudslides, soil infertility, and other forms of devastation representing the forces of death and destruction instead. The Earth mourns its lost productivity, just as a region mourns the loss of its vitality in the face of terror and conflict. The title references the contradictions and paradoxes inherent in the Naga stories of conflict, stories that have been misinterpreted and manipulated by outsiders. The poet cautions her readers in the poem Cain's Shoes. From a distance, things hardly ever resemble reality or show the bleeding and mourning ground. It's easy, much too easy to opine, avert, assert what ought to be. From a distance, what is seen or believed to be felt is far from reality. Monsoon Morning represents the poet's imperative to narrate these stories from an insider perspective in an attempt to challenge narratives quote from a distance. Monsoon Morning provides poetic insights into the dramatic enforcement of exceptionalism promoted by the Indian state, whose experimental governance of the region has not facilitated enduring peace. By using emergency laws such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the state can justify its so-called legitimate fight against domestic terrorism in the region, represented by the many forms of armed resistance to mainland rule. The poems highlight the ways in which this state of exception creates a chained historicity in Nagaland, a neo-colonial condition of bondage, quote, that kept us chained to be tamed, end quote. This is a quote from the poem, One of These Decades. The political agenda to create and maintain a tamed historicity in Nagaland represents one of the underlying tenets of the state's agenda of docility as a calculated strategy to, quote, change the color of our destiny, end quote. The imposition of new gods and leaders from the mainland has led to a feeling of lost ancestry and a profound sense of alienation akin to the near-death state of zombification, comparable to, quote, the living dead. Poet Reena Nurang from Arunachal Pradesh experiences a profound sense of unhoming in her home state, a symbol of her evicted identity as a Northeasterner. The idea of home is so complicated. Home isn't here. People look at me like I am from somewhere else. Where is home? Home is ironically a site of displacement for Northeasterners, a site of definitive unhoming. The racialization of identity sets up phenotypical markers of Indianness based on normative definitions of what constitutes a typical Indian face and what does not. Wouters and Subha introduced the concept of the Indian face as a discursive and somatic image, or what they call a face scape, wherein Northeasterners are often non-recognized and misrecognized as foreigners hailing from such places as China, Nepal, Thailand, or Japan. This form of phenotypical racism is directly inscribed in the nation's Charter of Exceptional Citizenship and its physical categories of who can be Indian or not. These identities in transit are suspended in an extraterritorial status of limbo, in the betwixt and the between, the here and now, a marker of the exilic post-colonial condition of dehumanized indigeneity. I thought I was human. Then you came and kept me in a box for safety and told me I was more, I was tribe, says Moran in the poem Nation. The tribal represents the lower citizen who is tattooed or nationed by the state's racist markers of exceptionalism. And you cartographed our bodies, states the poet, with a reference to body branding. Women experience a further level of branding in the stereotypical conflation between their constructed identities as Oriental Hills women and their supposedly unbridled sexual promiscuity. These imagined identities are a replay of colonial stereotypes of hypersexualized, ultra-exotified tribal women, objects of rape in the colonial imaginary, and victims of sexual violence by the army, the Indian Army, and insurgency, quote, wrapping me tenderly with ideas and violence. The violent governance of these tender orientalized bodies is reflected in the state's management of the equally mystified Northeast in patterns of homegrown Orientalism. Is it possible to make sense of war, conflict, and suffering without considering the silent and multiple wounds of women? This pain is manifold, extending beyond the physical and the psychological to include the social and economic spheres as well. The women's situation of dispossession reinforces their sense of solitude and isolation when they are neglected by the very communities they have nurtured. Life is so hard like this, states the narrator of Mamangdai's poem, The Sorrow of Women. If women are expected to be the socio-cultural pillars of their societies, the lack of support they receive from their immediate and extended families heightens their despair in the absence of support networks. Now I know why women beat their breasts, states the poet in the poem Midsummer. The pre-verbal language of the body remains their only recourse to expression. The intense beating of the breast sets up a rhythmic language of uncensored sounds and pulsating beats that defy silence through an internal spectrum of emotions and sensations beyond words. The power of this corporeal language underscores the women's urgency for survival within a necropolitical patriarchal structure that would rather see them suffer in silence. Quote, even though we are changed, are mute to see our growth. Similarly, Tensula O chronicles the devastation of the land through militarized takeovers of nature in her collected volume of poems, Book of Songs. An award-winning poet, short story writer, ethnographer of the O Naga oral traditions, O's many volumes of poetry are represented as songs. These songs highlight the cultural roots of the O Naga traditions and the importance of orality in maintaining social and cultural ancestral systems that face loss and neglect in the 21st century. O's songs also lament the tragedies of war and conflict, environmental abuse, the loss of community and identity in the face of rapid urbanization and maiming values. The poems reveal the poet's exilic consciousness expressed in terms of an interstitial space between belonging and non-belonging, where people are exiled in their own lands and imprisoned in their own minds. Exile condemns her people to a stateless condition in which they become refugees in their own land due to the state's heavy-handed control of indigenous properties. The sounds and sights have altered in my hills, as the poet. The land is imbued with an unfamiliar aura that creates a sense of cognitive dissonance for the poet. Once familiar sights and sounds betray their strangeness to intensify the poet's disorientation among the hills that represented spaces of tranquility and belonging in the past. The comforting sounds of nature expressed in birdsong are transformed into the tyranny of gunshots. These intrusive sounds penetrate and occupy open spaces with their ferocious tenacity. But today, I no longer know my hills. The birdsong is gone, replaced by the staccato of sophisticated weaponry. The poet experiences an extreme state of anxiety and dislocation when she becomes a stranger to her own environment. As a hills person, her psychological malaise intensifies when the comforting presence of her cherished hills no longer provides the security and permanence of home. The hills no longer speak to the poet, quote, with the wistful whispers of autumn leaves, end quote, a secret language that expresses communion with nature and the ancestral spirits. Instead, the wounded landscape sings its pain in bloodied rivers that flow upstream, quote, the rivers are running red. Once gurgling rivers and streams are now forced to choke with coagulated blood as a metaphor of Nagaland's bloody history, just as the barren hillsides are deprived of their force and vitality through environmental depletion. Nature's lost magic reveals the ways in which trauma embeds itself in the landscape through the broken imagery of barren landscapes and blood-swollen rivers and streams. Nature carries the visible wounds of conflict in sensorial form, quote, as a lost landscape of time. These environmental imbalances at home have spurred deep psychological imbalances within family and community, as experienced by the brutality of the fraternal conflict that marks the insurgency, as another chapter in the story of Nagaland. At what point do revolutionaries and freedom fighters turn against each other because of conflict-induced traumas that resist healing in the absence of peace? What happened in the jungles of Burma and others? What happened to turn brother against brother forever? Something took place there, in those wild, impenetrable jungles, where men's hearts turned impenetrable too. Something happened to my brothers, wonders Naga poet Esther Dinadalu in her haunting poem, When the Soul of a Nation Dies. The Naga guerrilla trained in the jungles of Burma now here. The poem raises the following questions. What does it mean to be haunted by trauma's non-resolution in the wild, impenetrable depths of conflict? How does the psychic residue lead to internalized forms of violence determined by power struggles and ethnic affiliations? How does the death of the soul through the violent act of zombification lead to repeating patterns of internalized violence? Why has the struggle for independence from an external enemy, the state, turned inward into rivalry among one's own brethren, brother against brother in all space? The poem reveals how the people are now forced to confront the enemy from within and without. Naga brothers have both ingested and reproduced the violence of the sovereign state to further their own pursuit of sovereign Naga power with impunity in mirroring acts of terror and destruction that have turned the land into killing fields. At the same time, these poets refuse to capitulate to despair and despondency through their resisting voices, nor defeated or silenced state's Jamia. They seek comfort in their insurrectional writings that imagine peace, denounce the violence that inhibits their lives. Their strong anti-war protest becomes their rallying cry for permanent peace as they continue to use poetry to affirm their identity, subjectivity, and dignity. Words are all that's left of them to give, states Jamia. Poetry represents a non-violent medium of protest and resistance to imagine a better world for future generations, a world in which the woman poet assumes the important roles of peace mediator, chronicler, literary archivist, and word warrior, in an act of defiance against a predetermined fate. Concluding. This poetry embodies its oppositional consciousness and strength of purpose while symbolizing a test of faith for what Chankita calls us defiant prisoners of fate. These prisoners of fate refuse imprisonment in a fated destiny through the liberating power of peace.
We move to our next speaker. The next presenter is Nairita Ghosh. Nairita, do I have you?
Yes, shall I begin?
So Nairita Ghosh is a graduate student in the Department of History and Culture, Jamia, Millia, University, New Delhi. The paper they are presenting today is titled Camp and Torture, Interrogating the Festive Ladies of the Gatha Saptasati. Nairita, you can take the floor.
Yes, thank you. Hello everyone, I started twice earlier but the link broke for some reason. Now I'm back again. So without wasting much time, I'll start. The title of the paper is called Camp and Couture, Camp or Couture, Integrating the Festive Ladies of Gatha Saptasati. The first part of this paper introduced the text. The text, Gatha text, the Gatha Saptasati, or in Prakrit it is called the Gatha Saptasai. It is Gaha Saptasai. It is written in Maharashtrian Prakrit language, and it's actually a compilation of multiple verses, as many as 700 verses belonging to 1st to 7th century CE. That were written by multiple male poets. And these are actually written in couplets and mostly are amorous poetry where women are either enticing men or into engaging with to get engaged with sexual activities, or they're expressing their desires because in the absence of their husbands who probably have gone away in a faraway land, either traveling or merchants, etc. The entire 700 verses were collected and compiled during the reign of King Hala, who's known to be the last Satavahana king to ever ruled over Deccan. So that also situates this text in the region of Deccan. The translation of used, the text is written in Maharashtra Prakrit, and Dr. Radha Govinda Boshak had translated into first into Sanskrit, as is the custom to Sanskrit to translate Prakrit text, and then into English in the year 1971 from the Asiatic Society of Bengal. In the year 2012, Asiatic Society of Bengal once again reprinted this text. So that is a text that that's a translation, particular translation that I've been using to write this thesis, write this paper. So there are 5 verses that I've used to write this paper, and all these verses belong to different centuries, from ranging from 1st to 7th. So they talk about women who are either co-wives or wife or maiden girl getting decked up to join different festivals, and while doing that they show us certain class differentiations, differences in spaces, as in habited spaces, in urban, rural, peripheral, etc. So there are 2 verses that belong to first, and one belong to 1st century CE, the other one belong to 6th century CE. They mention the wives of Vyadha or hunter, 2 hunters getting decked up in flowers, peacock feathers, and elephant pearls. Elephant pearls is probably something that is made out of pearls, made out of elephant tusks, so that is ivory beads, to attend the festivals. And the forest has provided them with such bright adders. Of course, they have meager means, and they cannot engage into buying such fine jewelries and fine adders. There is one verse that belongs to 6th century that talks about young maidens, multiple. They decorate themselves with kusuma flower, which is yellow in color, and they're wearing yellow clothing as well, and going to this festival, village festival, to entice suitable matches for marriage. There are two other verses that one belongs to 1st century CE, the other one belongs to 7th century CE. They depict the pictures of co-wives of Gahapatis or wealthy merchants. Gahapatis were pretty active, as a major social group during the early period of Indian history. They were wealthy merchants. They were financiers to the kings and also advisors to the kings, and on many occasions. These four wives of these Gahapatis, they are decorating themselves with fine clothes and jewelry, gems and clothes that was brought from faraway lands. That's what the verse is mentioned, which also, points to the fact that their husbands indeed were merchants dealing with fine articles. So what you see, the next part of this paper deals with the class and the regional variations. So the co-wives and the hunters, the hunters represent the peripheral locations bordering the forest land and the rural. How do you know this? How do you know this? Because, Professor Aloka Parashar Sen has done her seminal works on the lectures of ancient India, and she has shown how hunters, the Vyadhas, categorized the Shudra community as per the normative texts such as the Manusmriti and the Dharma Shastras. They were never, unless on special occasions, they were never allowed to enter habitable spaces that belong to three other different classes: the Brahmana, the Kshatriya, and the Vaishyas. So they were to reside at the end of the villages, by the forest, near the forest, and that is where the periphery lies. And that is why, they have this connection with the forest land. They're hunting and they're getting that, decorative pieces from the forest. So unless there were some special occasions, they were not allowed to enter the village residential areas. So we can assume that there were some festivals where they were allowed to participate in, and hence the wives are getting decked up in peacock feathers and elephant beads, etc. The maiden girl belongs to a village unit. The verses mentions Gaha or Grama, and the agricultural communities and belonging to agricultural community, which refers to the rural areas, because we also find like multiple grants, land grants, and during this period from 1st to 7th, 8th, 9th century CE, from this area where multiple land grants are being made, where either parcels of lands are being donated by the king to multiple villagers or to temples or to Brahmins to get cultivated. Forest lands and wetlands are also converted into cultivable land. So in order to put down roots, you have to stay in order to till a land. So the maiden girls who are, out there attracting suitable matches for marriage, they point towards this practice of continuous agriculture. Hence, the existence of village units, the rural settlements. In the third part, the co-wives of the merchants, they represent urban localities as commercial hubs and access points to finer clothes and trinkets. Obviously, because, Gahapatis, as wives of the Gahapatis were residing in the center of the localities, where they were related to economic policies and transactions, and also as advisor to the local government. So the co-wives, as they don on their fine jewelries and clothings and etc., they are pointing towards their own residential areas as belonging to an urban settlement. So the next part of this paper is called the decoding the dresses. Obviously, I have, it goes without saying, I have picked up the idea of camp from Susan Sontag's against interpretation and other essays. And it's been a long time since I wanted to, I really wanted to incorporate something from her wonderful writing. So she writes, this is too good to be camp, ... not marginal enough. So Sontag is laying down the rules as to what constitutes a certain piece of art, including clothings, among other things, cinema and, paintings and architecture as camp. So she says that camp refers to something that has an innocent grandiosity, something that is not serious, something that has a serenity of pastoralism. So she is pointing towards this, a plethora of multiple strands and multiple strands of ideas that constitute camp, because camp is not something that earlier, before Sontag was really paid attention to camp culture. It was too uncouth, it was too too crude. So she's saying that the grandiosity, that innocent grandiosity, when you put in too much together, too many things, too many blings together, because and there is no cohesion at all. There's no cohesion at all, and it's too much. But yet there is this innocence, and there is this lack of self that comes into it. And you look at a pastoral community or a pastoral ground where there's too much is happening, big field, too much is happening, yet there is this sense of serenity, this sense of peace. So what do we find here in these verses among the women is that the poets, the hunters who donned the peacock feathers, bright flowers, pearls made of ivory, all of it too exaggerated, too naive, betraying the seriousness of subtle dressing. The young girl, in the other case, who has to stay rooted, as a villager, and tend to the land for, seasonal continuance. And that's the kusuma flower, yellow in color. Kusuma flower is yellow in color, happens to be yellow, points towards the spring because it actually blooms during springtime, the season to mate, to till, to cultivate the land as well. So here too we get the reference of this idea, this connection of class and clothing, as well as lifestyle. The merchant wives, on the other hand, are too subtle in the fine garment, gems and jewelries, flaunting the social class, clearly differentiating from the previous classes. Their bespoke couture state their economic might. Couture is something that has to be order made. It has to be custom made. It is, not every class can afford to get, custom ordered, bespoke dress made. So here too, the wives of merchants, they too are, they too are differentiating themselves from the camp styles. So assessing and concluding this paper, what you see is point 1, class differentiation. There are 3 different classes we are seeing, settlement classes: peripheral, rural, and urban. In the peripheral classes, the hunter community who are living and surviving in the margins, they are living there. In the rural section, the girl belonging to the village and the girls belonging to the village wearing their yellow dresses and donning the flowers and, going out to find their mates, they belong to the rural settlement. And in the urban settlement, you find the wives of the merchants. What this very interesting text also does is to shed light on the occupations as hunters, agricultural communities, wealthy merchants. Lastly, the women, as they get dressed up, raise the question as to which social class decides what is camp. And this is also actually Sontag has sort of touched upon, and perhaps a further, so what is camp, right? So Sontag also mentions that the history of camp is very closely related to the history of snobbery, and is aristocrats who always decided what is to be constituted as camp or non-camp, not camp. But then we take a look at 18th century fashion, and we see all these, feathered ward hats and elaborate gowns. So is that to be accepted as a camp style or a couture style? So here we see that very clear, conflict of what is to be called camp and what is to be called couture. And perhaps the feathers and the elephant pearls constituted more of a class statement than subtle gems and trinkets announcing a more solid presence. As we all know, the Shudras, lower caste Shudras, they have always been lived in a very constricted space. They have almost never allowed into spaces inhabited by the other three class groups and multiple other social groups as well. So perhaps with these very loud attires and dressing sense and their garments and the jewelries in feathers and flowers and ivory beads, etc. Perhaps the wives, the hunters, they are making their own identity. They are making their own presence known on a more solid footing, so that to tell the rest of the communities, to the subtle garment ladies and the villagers, that they also are here, they exist, and that is something that have rarely been seen in other texts belonging to particularly this period of history. So thank you so much for your attention. That is the end of my paper.
Yes.
Yes.
Requesting everyone to bring up any questions they may have for Nairita. And also our fourth presenter is not here at the moment. We are not sure what happened. So we have the next 30 minutes to hand the two presenters are here with us. So any sort of Q&A would be appreciated at this moment.
So when did these African women first start coming to India? Is there a documentation of
when did they start coming? We have references, and one is that Africans were coming to India starting from the 1st century of the Common Era. Okay, there's no specific mention of the women. 13th, 14th century is about the time with the coming of the Islam to India, is the time when we are seeing references to women coming. And of course, the maximum numbers came in the 19th century. We see Africans brought in by the Portuguese in Goa. We see, of course, in Gujarat. It's the seafaring areas which receive the largest numbers. And it's interesting, they are not all coming as slaves. The perception always with slavery is that all these people are slaves. There were people who came as traders, wives or whatever, or merchants. And of course, there were mercenaries who came and then got their freedom. So it's a very different history. And I'm an Africanist by training, and I was fascinated at how different slavery is as when it goes to different places, and how many avenues for upward mobility there appeared to be in India compared to the New World of Americas or the Caribbean and United States.
How do you think the Portuguese acquired these black women?
Well, and they acquired them as slaves. They are coming from Mozambique. They are coming from Portuguese areas on the continent of Africa, mostly on the eastern seacoast of Africa. And the Portuguese are bringing them. And in fact, I'm looking at records, and it's fascinating. There are records from the early 19th century that say that every reasonably affluent home in Goa, for example, had 15 to 20 slaves, and they served the masters at the meal times, and they performed other. So it was a different kind of slavery, but you never see the upward mobility amongst slaves in Portuguese Goa, Portuguese Goa slavery, as you see in some other parts. And in fact, I didn't want to address anything but women in this paper because I wanted to really focus on women. But we are now becoming aware that in many states like Ahmednagar, for example, in the Deccan, African slaves who began as slaves and mercenaries, really because of their skills, their abilities, their intelligence, their loyalties, rise to positions that they themselves then become the kings. So we are wonderful. I'm not an art historian, but art historians need to tap into this. And from Ahmednagar, for example, there are lots of wonderful paintings of Africans who eventually became kings. And if you were to travel to my home state, what is technically my home state, Gujarat, some of the most beautiful architectural buildings. There is a Jali called Sidi Sayyadni Mosque and the Jali. Beautiful artwork done by a former slave. So avenues for independence were greater, and for women, like in Awadh, where the king really had a yell for African women. So they come in as concubines and then they become queens, and
That's Lucknow.
it's very unusual.
Awadh is Lucknow, right?
Awadh is it's in the northern part of India. And it was a very important princely state, and the last king of Awadh, for whatever reason, had many, many wives, of whom I'm just beginning to tap into the artwork.
Now, is the artwork represented in books?
In paintings? In paintings.
No, but are they published into books? I mean, how do you see them if you...
Yeah, well, some are and others aren't. So, royal paintings of the Nawab of Awadh, and then you got to sort of locate who is an African, because not all dark-skinned women are Africans, but their names are there. When you have Afroz or Fizza, it's a clear indication that you're talking in African. So it's a very interesting, and there they are dressed in Indian saris and Indian jewelry, but you can tell from the physical features that they are African. Very exciting. And now when I go back I did a lot of my field work in Gujarat amongst the cities. And what is also very interesting is the cities go to Andhra Pradesh, to Karnataka, to Goa, to Gujarat, to Maharashtra. And wherever they go, they adopt the religion and the dress and the food. So in the Gujarat city community, when I went, they are dressed in saris or salwar, sometimes salwar kurta. The food they offered me was Gujarati food. The language that they are speaking is often Gujarati intermixed with Urdu. It's fascinating how they are adapting to the different traditions that they encounter. Very different from slavery in other parts, where the slave lost a lot of their identity. The language went, the connection with Africa became bleaker and less obvious. For some reason, and the songs, I keep on thinking, I wish I could I haven't been to Goa to study. Then I need to know Portuguese, I need to know the Karnataka, the cities speak the local languages, which I don't. But my hope is that scholars will, so I had written a book, and you must have seen it. It got published in, I think, 2017 or 18. But that is very much, it talks about India, but it's very much, field work in Gujarat, because that's what I could do. I would love to see people do things in Karnataka. And if I had funding, I'd go and, learn the language and do it. And Brinda brings in the songs. The cities have a lot of songs. You've got to know the language. I mean, Gujarati I can handle. But the others are difficult. In Karnataka, I wouldn't be also. It's a very exciting field. And yet, it's kind of also sad because having said that there was potential for upward mobility, the reality is that the cities are totally neglected. They are forgotten. They live in ghetto kinds of situations. Nobody in Ahmedabad, where I go, if I ask them and say, where are the cities? They don't, the locals don't know. You're going to seek them out because they shun them and the cities themselves prefer to stay in their own community. There's so much poverty, an incredible amount of poverty. So that's why the last section of the paper for me was important to see who's doing any work in terms of empowerment. Are there organizations that are actually educating city girls? Otherwise they get married at a young age and have children and then there's no future for them. And there is potential, there's incredible potential. It's just that Indian society sadly is also very race conscious, very color conscious. These people are totally neglected. The
Do they have any connection with Africa? They lost all ties.
Well, when I asked them, I said, how do you identify yourself? And they all laughed and they said, of course I'm an Indian. When my grandparents were here, my great-grandparents, they came, we don't even know where people. On the other hand, they recognize the spiritual ancestry of theirs to Africa. So there are two or three areas in which they are really connecting with Africa. One is the music and the dance. If you go and watch and observe their Urs dance and zikr, prayers and music, there's a lot of connection with Africa. They themselves often don't know that there are Swahili words. Now I learned Swahili for my doctoral work, so I could sort of suddenly pick up and say, do you know this word? And they wouldn't know, but it's a Swahili word, that's what they're just borrowing it. So there's a lot of very interesting borrowing. It's to me this acculturation process as to how a community that's been there for 700 years will keep something that's valuable, such as the music and the dance and the female saints. How many of us can identify female saints as being major figures in Indian spiritual life? Not too many. But for the Africans, my Misra, the other female saints are very important. So that is a direct connection with Africa. Spirit possession. We do see it in India, in some communities. But when you are possessed and you are a healer and you predict future and you cure the sick and the afflicted, that gives you a kind of power that otherwise you don't have. So for that moment in time, you are in the center stage. And so I think, there are areas that were very interesting, the spirit possession. And I found this a direct connection with Africa, where spirit possession is so important. And the spirit medium becomes so revered in the community because they are the healers and they are the curers. And so, it's a very interesting subject and one can get so these kids, I just came back from India, a trip to India, and this 2014 or 15 is when I started my field work, maybe 2013. And there were young children, and I'm no photographer, and I'd go and say to them, let me just take a picture of you people. And they would all circle around because they're children, they're not self-conscious. And finally I told Routledge, I said, you will not just take any photograph, you will put this on the book because I want the children to remember that they were important. When I went back this time, they all came and they are all married women with 3 children and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm remembering them as 7-year-olds and 10 years old, early marriages of course. And so it's a forgotten. In Gujarat and elsewhere, there's a sense that it's better to just pretend they don't exist because of color, because of race, because of whatever. There are no opportunities for that. And the opportunities that exist a little stereotypical, saying Africans should go into sports. I mean, I feel some sense of frustration with that also. They can go into many fields, but the idea that, brawn rather than brains. they have to be given the opportunity for the brain. So there are things happening, and I would like to. And there are scholars who are now suddenly jumping into studying them. Suddenly it's become a hot. When I first started, there were very few people who were interested. And there is a woman from California called Caitlin Jaira's boy, who started what is called a Malunga project, music. And she goes and records their music, musical instruments, and she provides funding so that their music will continue. So the African traditions will not die out with new generations. But it's all about funding. You've got to fund students. I keep on thinking, if I made big money, which I absolutely don't from the sale of, I would seek out organizations that are helping these people. And in some way, my work fits in with Brinda. Brinda is talking about also marginalized women in the Northeast and Mizoram, Nagaland. These are the ones who have to study. I mean, others have, status of women have been studied in India. I myself have done it for years, but there's not a heck of a lot that's new there. But these are what is so exciting.
Purnima, I had a question. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. That in terms of Islam, they also practice a particular kind of Islam with this mixture of Sufism and as well as the animism. And so, because Sufism has a whole tradition of female saints like Rabia,
Of course.
and so could that also be part?
Very much. So the Sufi tradition is very strong. And that's the positive thing. I always found that Sufi Islam, it appeals to me because it makes space for people who are otherwise marginalized. And the use of dance and music in Iraq and Turkey. I mean, dance and music becomes the vehicle for communicating with Allah. I mean, it's a whole different dance. So yeah, that's very true. And Brinda, actually, I had a question for you. I don't know if it's a question. Your paper very beautifully talks, narrates the stories of trauma and environmental degradation and loss suffered by these women in the Northeast. Is there love poetry there? I always think of poetry. I mean, it's an explosion of the heart, whether it is from grief or loss or bloodshed or love. Is there love poetry?
There's love poetry, but it's inscribed in war because you cannot, separate the literature from what's actually, happening to the Norwegian today. Like, for example, Mamandai's poem, The Sorrow of Women, it is a poem of love, a mother's love for a child who's just about to be, who's going to fight, who's been recruited, in the insurgency. So there is that sense of love, but it's like love and mourning and grief come together. And that's what makes this poetry so poignant.
And once again, I don't know enough about this, but there must be works on subaltern women and their writings. I mean, writings, of course, if they are writing, they're already, somebody's educated, but oral tradition.
Yeah, and that's why the importance of this.
Very good.
Because,
and that's why we must, I think, young scholars and people who are doing research really need to go out and record, because in the songs we will find material that we don't find in written stuff always.
And also, to put indigenous languages in the curriculum. Why is it always the state identified language? And these are just listening to Mamandai, recite her poetry in her own language. I mean, you sense it. It takes you to a different dimension. These are also, these are Indian languages. Also, the women had to form their own publishing house, because Hornbill Press, because nobody was, till Urvashi Butalia from Kali for Women then started, incorporating. She has a whole section, but once again, it's writings from the Northeast, not contemporary women's writing or post-colonial something.
A lot needs to be done, and it's so exciting, and women, I feel, why would I go study men? I mean, now at least I see that. I said, I have a limited time, my life is short, I'm going to do the things that I feel passionate about, and women, particularly marginalized women. There's so much, and their art, their music, their songs, their poetry, their lives, they're just so much potential and so exciting.
But a parallel trend that's really bothering me is how all this is being co-opted by white scholars and for Dalit literature, because we were so blind to the cultural and literary production in India, and it was like, oh, they don't know how to write. So then all the French that people have stepped in, and now they become scholars of the literature, and they push us up.
No, that's very true.
It's really, they come to India, they're treated like, royalty. They get access to centers and things that yes, Indian scholars don't have access to.
And a lot has to do with the mental colonization of the mind that Indians are suffering, and that is so sad actually, because if it doesn't come from the West, we don't agree to a lot of the things coming from a very mental health perspective. How we have the DSM, the ICD as as standards for global standards for mental health, which itself is a big shock, because certain mental health issues specific to women also in India are very culturally very appropriate to have. The way we women are sort of empowered to speak about in a very communal culture in India. If you look at it from a very Western perspective, it will come under some kind of disorder, and that's actually very sad.
You're absolutely right.
How about yourself? Tell us about yourself.
I'll be presenting tomorrow. I teach art history at East Carolina University.
So you're tomorrow evening?
Tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning.
What are you going to be speaking?
I'm speaking on my study tour to Cambodia. I visited Cambodia in 2019, December. That's what I'll be doing. Studied the Buddhist and Hindu temples, the imagery, that's what I'll be doing.
Oh, lovely. I have to, I was in India, I just came back a month ago, and I had planned the trip to Cambodia. It was like a bucket list thing. I really wanted to go, well, for health reasons or this or that, I had to cancel everything. So it's still something that's in the back of my mind. Anyone interested in Indian art or any kind of art would someday want to visit. Before one gets too old, I keep on thinking there's a lot of climbing that.
And before those images get more eroded, because they are better in the books than inside. They're constantly exposed to weather conditions. I mean, I just already saw that the images in the books are much better than what I saw face to face. And you can't get close to too many of them because they put ropes around them. You're seeing them from a distance.
So the preservation is, they don't have the techniques.
But how much can you do? 3 months a day?
And funding, something like UNESCO or whatever can fund big projects like that. But otherwise, countries that are struggling.
If everything is open to weather conditions, it's not going to survive for too long. So it's good to go and see. And everything is very well organized and preserved.
Okay.
So it was a very nice visit to Cambodia. To Siem Reap, that's where I went. I didn't get to go to the capital, Phnom Penh. I didn't go just one place. And when I said I've come here for 9 days, it shocked people because people just stay there 2-3 days and go away. Nobody stays that long. But I was there for studying 9 days seems for them a lot. For me, I thought it was a short visit, but
And much of your work is in what, in embroidery?
that was one paper. I keep moving from different one. It had empowerment of women. That was, but in Cambodia, that's not empowerment of women. It is more about the French occupation of
Correct.
Cambodia and how that influenced their art, and also that also is fascinating. That chapter of Cambodian art, and then how these all of this influences from India, Hinduism and Buddhism,
Certainly.
and how they transformed it. That was interesting to me. And it's a blend of India and China, which is interesting to me because that's my background. So I studied Chinese art history and Indian art, and so to see how they blend it and how it's going.
In fact, you were in my thoughts. It's interesting how I've seen you, because when I first encountered the weaving tradition of the CD, which I knew nothing about, even though I had studied them for several years, and I saw their finished product. I kept on thinking, that again, nobody seems to know about it until somebody suddenly says, oh my God, they are weaving these beautiful patchwork things made out of saris. And it's only when somebody steps in and says, this, she needs to be marketed. And then these poor women get something. Otherwise, these are only given as gifts at weddings to their daughters, and to the newly married couple. But I thought
In
about...
fact, the lesser known embroideries, that is what I need to focus on. But where do I get the literature? I focus on the best known embroideries of India because there's literature on that.
Correct.
But the lesser known, there are so many lesser known embroideries which are worth bringing to light.
There was about 8 or 9 years ago, there was an exhibit on the Siddiq quilts at the Schomburg in New York.
Wow.
And I think his name is Omar.
Yes.
So he was the one who curated the whole.
I have worked with Omar on a book. I mean, but I don't know him personally. I didn't know he worked on it.
Yeah, it was a huge exhibit that, with the history
And they're beautiful quilts. I mean, I keep on thinking, all these years, I should have picked up a quilt just for record's sake so I could possess one. But I never thought about that. Of course, for them, it's an everyday thing. They are making it for their daughters. They're making it for an occasion. And I'm sure somebody else, a middle person, is getting rich on selling them. I mean, that's the other tragedy. The person who really puts in the effort doesn't get their due share, and somebody else.
There are many NGOs now protecting these women. I don't know if they reached out to the city women.
They should, because Ahmedabad is a center for seva and all. So I kept on thinking that, next time I go, which is October, I will try to talk to seva people and say that they should work with the CD communities and promote these women's quilts by making sure they get their fair share of what their effort, and then sell it in a market where it will be better. So much to be done and so little time.
And that's why, like in Mexico and Oaxaca and all, they have the women's cooperatives. So the money goes directly. There's no middle person.
Yeah.
So we should something like that.
Totally. In fact, I was joking with my husband and telling him yesterday that if I made some big money, I'm going to go back and do something for CD, young girls' education, because, the future is with education. I'm worried that they get married. I mean, that's true for Indian girls in general in rural areas too. But education will open up doors in ways that will change their lives. And there has to be an NGO, there has to be an organization that's themselves not interested in making money, but is interested in the cause itself. So, that's a project.
Maybe that's our responsibility as diasporic scholars, to give back.
Absolutely.
But do you also think there's a geographical segregation in Ahmedabad? Because I've lived in Ahmedabad myself, and it was very strange encounters that we had with, especially someone belonging to the Muslim community, right? So I was living in most of the Hindu places where you DPS, right? So it was like, it was quite strange, and I was quite young. I did not know how it was happening. But when I look back, and there was actually a geographical segregation.
Oh yes, oh yes. And you're not, you're not an exception. My grandparents lived in Ahmedabad. I grew up in Delhi, but throughout, I came to the US to study. But I didn't know about them. So how is it that nobody, my parents didn't mention, did they know my grandparents who lived there did? And why did nobody mention that there was this whole community and 2 or 3 communities? And they're living there for hundreds of years and nobody bothers to go. Now suddenly there's a onslaught of Westerners, so very interested in, because it's the African connection. And I'm worried about that too, because there's a negative side to that. Somebody called me up, a psychiatrist in Washington, and said, "You are an expert on the CDs," and I said, "Not at all. I'm just interested in studying them, and I'm doing what I can." And he said, "Well, we are taking a team to Ahmedabad, and would you please go and make an appointment so that we can visit the CDs?" I had some real emotional things about, they are not animals in a zoo to be looked at.
Yeah.
You are seriously interested, then you go and one-on-one talk to them. But people sort of walking through, 10 Americans walking through their houses and their places, and I felt very uncomfortable doing that. So it's how a researcher goes in, and you really have to become you have to gain their trust, and you have to, and it can't happen in 2 or 3 visits, right? And it's the challenge for a researcher, but it has to be done. You cannot be an outsider who's just interested in studying them for the sake of what your research gets. Yes. All kinds of ethical issues that scholars face, What do you make out of it? I mean, I never made any, thankfully enough, that I don't feel guilty, but I didn't make a lot of money out of this. I didn't make money. But it is something one has to take it. And there are some scholars who are putting the money back. Jairaj putting all the money back to make sure the CD music will forever be around. Recording it and making sure the younger generation learns how to play, because the instruments are all originally coming from Africa. We don't have those instruments in Gujarat, in Indian music or whatever. And it's wonderful that you have to go to their festivals, you have to be a part of their lives before you have access to it. It's tough to feel, short-term stints living in the US, and then going there isn't good enough. And so I always think that more and more, I would like to spend time in India, because then you are becoming gradually accepted as one of them, not as somebody who comes from America and goes away.
And I think living in India is also, it's not just about the physicality of being able to having more proximity, it's also the way they relate with their daily life activities. Certain things, language itself is a barrier sometimes, right? Like
very much.
Because language itself is a lens of looking at reality, and living very close to the culture, the tradition itself is research, it's like a process. It's like, you have to sort of drop the outside of yourself. And
very true. Yes, very true.
I did my art history project in Ahmedabad, and I came across a lot of Sidi Saidi Jali, and it was beautiful.
And there's the Julta Minara. Nowhere in the world you see 2 minarets or 2 minars, and you go up and it actually moves. This is beautiful. The Ahmedabad is architecturally a very rich.
Very rich.
I'm only now beginning to discover how much I love it. The textiles blow your mind. In the rural areas you get out, and they're very beautiful women, very beautiful traditions, and So, but you have to be there for a long. How is it? Are you from Gujarat originally?
No. So my father was in the Indian Railways. So we
Okay.
were traveling all over India. But I lived in Ahmedabad for 5 years straight.
Oh, how nice.
Yes.
You probably have lived longer than I have. I mean, I just stayed in Delhi and then came here. But now I go back twice every year.
Yes.
And all I do is just this. I just sort of breathe in Ahmedabad and let myself just...
It has changed a lot apparently. Like when I was studying in school, it wasn't that populated. There was less traffic. But now I hear a lot of stories like
terrible traffic. Huh? I daren't. I just take a rickshaw, three-wheeler, and where I go. And the house won't be there for too long. It's a house that my grandmother built, so it's 100-year-old. It's right in the heart. Ahmedabad must have a population, I could be completely wrong here, but maybe 6 to 7 million people. It's right in the heart of the city. There are trees that were grown in her time, which are big trees. And on any day, there are 14 to 16 monkeys who jump from tree to tree to tree, threatening you if they have little babies, and there are peacocks there. It's like living in the wilderness. I can't get enough of it. I mean, it's an old house, there are no creature comforts there, but it's just, there is character there.
My encounter with Ahmedabad, at one point I thought I wanted to study textiles. The National Institute of
Design.
And oh my God, 3 times I tried, I never got in. It was so demoralizing. But then I discovered art history. I didn't even know art history existed when I was pursuing that. And then when I went to Shantiniketan and discovered art history, I was so happy with that.
But NID, and National Institute of Design, is absolutely, premier. I wish we had connected earlier, because a lot of the professors there, they're no longer there. They've left, they're retired, they're my age, taught for many, many years in design at the NID. And so, it is really for design, for textiles. It's a wonderful day. But so is Shantiniketan. There's so many
in different ways, yeah. I mean, there all of India is competing for 25 places. So
yeah. NID is, you are right, absolutely.
Very competitive.
But at least come and visit.
I remember for years they put my picture, because we had to go through, I think, 3 days of exams. Then they will select you, and they put my picture on their brochure, but they didn't take me. So I found that.
No, and on their behalf, I want to apologize.
No, but I remember the interview. Yeah, I'm not very good at interviews. I just didn't think it was a fair exam. I don't know how it was for 3 days and how they select them. So I didn't. Once I went in person, 2 times, then they allowed you to interview from Calcutta itself. But the whole process was just terrible. Even in Shantiniketan, I was not good at interviews. I was so unsure, full of doubts. So I don't reflect well in interviews. So they also had difficulty getting in. Thankfully, once I got in there, it was good.
Next time you come, you and I will go to the NID, National Institute, and I'll introduce you to the professors there who are friends of mine. But no, you're doing very good work. So NID is just one of those. And what we didn't get, well, you have to let it go. There are other.
Like I said, I wouldn't have known art history existed if I'd gone there.
Absolutely, one door closes and 5 windows open somewhere else.
That's been the story of my life. I'm sure many others.
Absolutely.
So what's your field?
So I'm currently doing my PhD in East-West psychology. So I'm already a practitioner, in India. So it's psychology in a way. Yes.
So do you live in India?
Yes, I just came here for my coursework. Yeah.
Where in India?
Delhi. Not exactly Delhi, Gurgaon.
Oh, yeah, which is very much now the center of Delhi. Everybody talks. For us, Gurgaon, when I was in college, which was in the 60s and 70s, Gurgaon was out in the boonies. There was nothing there, and now it's the center of activity.
Yes.
That's exciting.
Yes.
I was there in Delhi. All my buddies from colleges do that.
Have you done your college from Delhi also?
I did my, I studied in Miranda House, my BA and MA,
Is it?
and then I taught at Miranda House.
Amazing. I did my bachelor's from Lady Shriram.
Ah, okay. You were a competitor. No, I think, I always thought that LSR was much better. The only reason Miranda seemed nice was that all the boys of St. Stephen's were closer to us.
Yeah, LSR is already cut off.
Yeah, but LSR was top notch, absolutely,
Yeah.
even in those days.
Yes.
Right? How nice, what a small world. And so I consider myself very much a Delhi. I grew up
Me
there,
too,
went to
myself.
school there, college there, taught there, and then came to the US. And at this time, during my visit, I went back to Delhi to see all these old buddies. They're all old fogies like myself, but it was so nice to see, and the friendships have remained so strong after 60 years. We've seen some of them after 65 years, and it's just very emotional to go back to.
Still is for me too. Whenever I'm in Delhi, it's
Good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you.
yeah, it's a beautiful. I don't know. Right now, it's like going through a lot of climate problems, pollution and everything, which I'm sad about. But I don't know. It's a very deep connection I have with the city.
I sympathize.
Yes.
We haven't got your
Yeah,
name.
about
I mean, the